The rain hammered against the corrugated metal roof of the abandoned warehouse like bullets from heaven. 10-year-old Marcus Chen pressed himself deeper into the shadows, clutching a half-empty can of beans he'd salvaged from the ruins of what used to be downtown Portland. The alien invasion had ended 3 months ago, but the aftermath still painted the world in shades of gray and desperation. A sound echoed through the cavernous space, something between a whimper and a growl. Marcus froze, his small fingers tightening around the rusty can opener. The sound came again, weaker this time, from the far corner where twisted metal beams created a maze of shadows. Against every survival instinct his father had drilled into him before the bombs fell, Marcus crept toward the noise. His worn sneakers made no sound on the debris-strewn concrete. As he rounded a massive support beam, his breath caught in his throat. A dragon lay crumpled among the wreckage. Not the mythical kind from his grandmother's stories, but something far more terrifying and beautiful. The creature stretched nearly 20 feet from snout to tail, its scales shimmering with an opalescent quality that seemed to shift between deep purple and midnight blue. Massive wings, torn and bloodied, were folded against its flanks. One wing hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, but it was the eyes that stopped Marcus cold. Golden, intelligent, and filled with a pain so profound it made his chest ache. The dragon's great head turned toward him, and Marcus expected to die. Instead, those ancient eyes simply watched him with what could only be described as curiosity. The creature's breathing was labored, each exhale sending small puffs of what looked like glittering dust into the air. Dark blood, almost black in the dim light, pooled beneath its massive form. One of its front talons, each the size of Marcus's forearm, twitched weakly. Marcus had seen enough wounded animals in the ruins to recognize the signs. This magnificent being was dying. The logical part of his mind screamed at him to run. Dragons were the apex predators of the Kitharan fleet, the shock troops that had swept through Earth's defenses like they were made of paper. He'd watched from his family's basement as these creatures had torn through tank battalions and reduced skyscrapers to rubble with their plasma breath. But this dragon wasn't breathing plasma. It wasn't even moving beyond those shallow, painful breaths, and something in those golden eyes reminded him of Rusty, his old golden retriever, in the moments before they'd had to put him down. "Hey there," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the rain. "You're hurt pretty bad, aren't you?" The dragon's head shifted slightly, following his voice. A low rumble emerged from its throat, not threatening but almost questioning. Marcus took a tentative step closer. The dragon didn't react aggressively, so he took another, and another. Soon he was close enough to see the intricate patterns etched into its scales, like living artwork that told stories he couldn't read. The creature's injuries were worse than he'd initially thought. Deep gouges ran along its flanks, and he could see the white gleam of bone through one particularly nasty wound. Burn marks scarred its hide in several places, and that broken wing looked like it had been caught in some kind of explosion. "You're one of the bad guys," Marcus said softly, settling cross-legged just out of reach of those massive claws. "But you don't look very bad right now." The dragon's eyes followed his movements with an intelligence that was unsettling. Marcus had the distinct impression that it understood him, even if it couldn't respond. His stomach growled loudly in the silence, and Marcus looked down at his can of beans. He'd been saving them for dinner, but dinner seemed like a luxury when faced with a dying creature that had probably never known hunger before this moment. "Are you hungry?" he asked, feeling foolish for talking to what was essentially an alien war machine. "I mean, I know you probably eat like whole cows or something, but this is all I've got." He popped open the can with practiced efficiency and scooted closer. The dragon's nostrils flared and its eyes focused on the can with what looked suspiciously like interest. "It's not much," Marcus admitted, "but my dad always said you can't think straight when you're hungry." Using his finger, he scooped out a small portion of beans and held his hand out toward the dragon's massive head. Those golden eyes fixed on his outstretched palm, then looked up to meet his gaze. For a moment, Marcus thought he'd made a terrible mistake. Then, with infinite care, the dragon's tongue, surprisingly warm and almost cat-like in texture, gently licked the beans from his palm. The rumble that followed was definitely not threatening. If Marcus didn't know better, he'd say it sounded almost like a purr. "You are hungry," he said with a smile, offering another palmful. "What happened to you? Did the other dragons leave you behind?" The creature's eyes dimmed at his words, and its great head sank a little lower. Marcus felt a stab of guilt. Whatever had happened, It was clearly painful in more ways than just the physical. He continued feeding the dragon small portions of beans, talking softly as he worked. About his father, who'd been a marine biologist before the invasion. About his mother, who'd died in the first wave of attacks. About how he'd been living alone in the ruins for 2 weeks now, scavenging and hiding from the cleanup crews that shot anything that moved. The dragon listened to it all, those intelligent eyes never leaving his face. When the can was empty, Marcus found himself sitting much closer to the massive creature, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from its scales. "I should go," he said reluctantly as the light outside began to fade. "The patrols come through here sometimes, and if they find you—" He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what would happen. As Marcus stood to leave, the dragon made a sound, a soft, almost musical note that seemed to come from deep in its chest. When he looked back, those golden eyes held something he hadn't expected to see. Gratitude. Marcus Chen had no way of knowing that he'd just fed the former crown prince of the Kitharan Empire, heir to a throne that spanned 17 star systems. He had no idea that the creature before him had been cast down by his own people for the crime of showing mercy to human civilians. All he knew was that tomorrow, he'd bring more food. The dragon watched the small human disappear into the ruins, and for the first time since his exile began, Prince Zephyr felt something other than despair. He felt hope. Marcus returned the next morning with a backpack full of supplies he'd scavenged from a nearby convenience store. The dragon was exactly where he'd left him, though those golden eyes tracked his approach with what seemed like eager anticipation. "Good morning," Marcus said, settling down beside the massive creature with the casual ease of someone who'd apparently decided that befriending apex predators was perfectly normal. "I brought breakfast." He'd managed to find several cans of food, some bottled water, and even a first aid kit that looked mostly intact. The dragon watched with interest as Marcus unpacked his haul, that low rumbling purr starting up again when the boy opened a can of peaches. "Do dragons eat fruit?" Marcus asked, offering a slice on his palm. The dragon's response was to delicately pluck the peach from his hand with the tip of one massive claw, then toss it back like a person eating popcorn. Over the course of the morning, Marcus discovered several fascinating things about his new companion. First, the dragon was definitely intelligent. Not just animal smart, but genuinely unmistakably sentient. It understood questions and responded with different sounds and gestures. Second, it seemed to have a sweet tooth that rivaled Marcus's own. And third, most surprisingly, it appeared to be trying to communicate. The breakthrough came when Marcus was examining the dragon's broken wing, making sympathetic noises about how much it must hurt. The dragon suddenly pressed one talon against the concrete floor and began to trace shapes. Marcus watched in amazement as elegant symbols appeared in the dust and debris. "You can write," he breathed. "You're trying to tell me something." The dragon's eyes brightened and it carefully traced more symbols. Marcus studied the alien script, wishing desperately that he could read it. Then the dragon did something unexpected. It traced letters. "Roman letters ZEPHYR, Zephyr," Marcus said aloud. "Is that your name?" The rumbling purr that followed was unmistakably affirmative. "Zephyr," Marcus repeated, testing the name. "I'm Marcus." "Nice to meet you, Zephyr." The dragon Zephyr carefully traced MARCUS in the dust, then looked up at the boy with what could only be described as pleasure. Over the following days, their unlikely friendship deepened. Marcus learned that Zephyr was not just any dragon, but someone important, though the exact details remained frustratingly unclear due to the language barrier. Zephyr learned that Marcus was alone in the world, surviving on wit and determination in a city that had become a graveyard. Marcus also discovered that Zephyr was a remarkably good listener. He found himself talking about things he hadn't spoken of since the invasion. His fears, his loneliness, his desperate hope that somewhere in the ruins, other humans were still alive and fighting. "The weird thing is," Marcus said one afternoon while sharing a can of soup with his massive friend, "before the invasion I was terrified of everything. Spiders, the dark, talking to other kids at school. Now I'm having lunch with a dragon, and it feels like the most normal thing in the world." Zephyr tilted his great head, those golden eyes studying Marcus with an intensity that was both comforting and slightly unsettling. It was on the 5th day that everything changed. Marcus arrived at the warehouse to find Zephyr agitated, his head raised and nostrils flaring. The dragon was making urgent sounds, pointing with one claw toward the far end of the building. "What is it?" Marcus whispered, but then he heard it too. The distinctive whine of anti-gravity engines. A Kytheran patrol ship. Marcus's blood turned to ice. If they found Zephyr here, injured and unable to fight or flee, they would either kill him or drag him away. And if they found Marcus, hide, he hissed to Zephyr, then realized how ridiculous that sounded. Where was a 20-foot dragon supposed to hide? The engines grew louder. Zephyr made a decision that would haunt Marcus for weeks afterward. He used his good wing to sweep the boy behind a pile of debris, then positioned himself protectively in front of the hiding spot. "No," Marcus whispered urgently. "Zephyr, don't—" The warehouse doors exploded inward. 3 Kytheran soldiers entered, their powered armor gleaming despite the dust and rain. Marcus had never seen them up close before, and the sight was terrifying. They stood nearly 8 feet tall in their suits, moving with deadly grace as their helmets swept the interior of the building. They spoke in their own language, harsh syllables that echoed off the walls. Marcus couldn't understand the words, but he could guess their meaning when all 3 weapons trained on Zephyr. What happened next defied everything Marcus thought he knew about the alien invaders. Zephyr didn't try to fight. Instead, he lowered his great head to the ground in what was unmistakably a gesture of submission. Then he spoke, not the rumbles and purrs Marcus had grown accustomed to, but actual words in the Kytheran language. The soldiers froze, their weapons wavering. The conversation that followed was tense and rapid fire. Marcus caught glimpses of the soldiers' faces through their helmet visors, shock, confusion, and something that might have been fear. One of them kept gesturing at Zephyr's injuries, while another seemed to be arguing. Finally, the lead soldier stepped forward and said something that made Zephyr's eyes blaze with sudden fury. The dragon reared up to his full height, broken wing and all, and roared something back that made all 3 soldiers take an involuntary step backward. There was a moment of tense silence. Then the lead soldier spoke again, his tone now respectful, almost deferential. He gestured toward the exit. Zephyr turned his great head toward Marcus's hiding place. Their eyes met across the shadowy distance, and Marcus saw something in that golden gaze that made his chest tight with grief. Goodbye. The dragon followed the soldiers out of the warehouse, moving slowly but with dignity. Just before he disappeared through the ruined doorway, Zephyr looked back one more time. Marcus waited until the sound of engines had faded completely before emerging from his hiding spot. The warehouse felt cavernous and empty without Zephyr's massive presence. In the dust where his friend had lain, symbols were traced in the dirt, a message left behind. Marcus couldn't read most of it, but at the bottom, scratched carefully in Roman letters, were 2 words that made his eyes burn with unshed tears. Thank you. That night, as Marcus huddled alone in his cold shelter, he made a promise to himself. Somehow, some way, he was going to find out what had happened to Zephyr, and if his friend was in trouble, which seemed likely given the soldiers' behavior, Marcus was going to find a way to help. It was an impossible promise from a 10-year-old boy with no resources, no allies, and no plan. It was also the most important promise Marcus Chen would ever make. Unknown to Marcus, 3 star systems away, the Kytheran High Command was receiving a report that would change the course of the war. Prince Zephyr had been found alive, in the company of a human child who had shown him kindness. The implications were staggering, and the political ramifications would soon reach far beyond one small warehouse in the ruins of Portland. 3 weeks after Zephyr's capture, Marcus had established a new routine. Every morning he would venture deeper into the ruined city, searching for other survivors and gathering information about Kytheran movements. Every evening he would return to study the symbols Zephyr had left behind, determined to crack the alien language. His breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While scavenging in the university district, Marcus discovered a linguistics professor named Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, hiding in the basement of the destroyed library. She was thin and haunted-looking, but her eyes lit up with scholarly excitement when Marcus showed her the carefully copied symbols. Remarkable, she breathed, adjusting her broken glasses as she studied Marcus's notebook. This appears to be High Kytheran script, the formal written language of their ruling class. Where on earth did you find this? Marcus hesitated, then decided that if he was going to trust anyone with Zephyr's secret, it might as well be someone who could actually help. He told her everything. Dr. Chen listened without interruption, her expression shifting from skepticism to wonder, to something approaching awe. When Marcus finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Do you understand what you've done?" she asked finally. "According to every xenobiological study we managed before the invasion, Kitharan dragons are incapable of forming emotional bonds outside their own species. They're described as perfect killing machines, intelligent, yes, but utterly without empathy." "Well, they're wrong," Marcus said simply. "Zephyr wasn't like that at all." Dr. Chen began working on the translation immediately. What she discovered sent shockwaves through the small network of surviving academics and resistance fighters she'd been in contact with. The message wasn't just a thank you. It was a warning. "Listen to this," Dr. Chen said, her voice shaking as she read from her translation. "Brother in shadow who feeds the fallen prince. The Council of Claws has decreed the cleansing of all human settlements within 7 cycles. The Mercy-bringer Zephyr spoke truth. Your species possesses the heart fire that ours has forgotten. Seek the deep places where the Earth Speakers dwell. The ancient compact may yet be honored." Marcus stared at the translation. "What does that mean?" "What's the ancient compact?" "I don't know," Dr. Chen admitted. "But it sounds like your friend was trying to tell you something crucial. And Marcus, if this is accurate, we have less than a week before they launch a final extermination campaign." The next few days passed in a blur of desperate activity. Dr. Chen's contacts in the resistance network spread the word, and suddenly Marcus found himself at the center of something much larger than his friendship with a lonely dragon. The revelation that a Kitharan prince had shown kindness to a human child, and more importantly, that the child had been able to return that kindness, sparked a wildfire of hope among the scattered survivors. It proved what many had suspected but none had dared to voice. The dragons weren't the emotionless monsters they pretended to be, but it was Marcus's simple act of sharing his food that truly captured the imagination of the resistance. Here was a 10-year-old boy who had faced one of humanity's most feared enemies, and responded not with hatred or fear, but with compassion. It became a symbol of everything the survivors were fighting to preserve. The story spread through the underground networks faster than any official broadcast could have managed. In bunkers and hidden settlements across the globe, people began to whisper about the boy who fed a dragon. More importantly, it changed how the survivors saw themselves. "Don't you understand?" Dr. Chen explained to a gathering of resistance leaders in an abandoned subway tunnel. "For months, we've been thinking of ourselves as victims, as the losing side in a war we never wanted. But this changes everything. If their own prince could be moved by human kindness, then maybe we're not fighting for mere survival. Maybe we're fighting for something they've lost." The underground meeting was interrupted by an urgent transmission from a scout team. Kitharan forces were mobilizing in unprecedented numbers. The cleansing that Zephyr had warned about was beginning ahead of schedule. "We need to evacuate the civilian populations," one of the military officers said. "Get them to the deep shelters before—" "No," Marcus interrupted, his young voice cutting through the adult conversation with startling authority. "That's not what Zephyr meant. He said to seek the deep places where the Earth Speakers dwell. I think he was trying to tell us about something specific." Dr. Chen's eyes widened. "The coal mines," she said suddenly. "About 50 miles north of here, there's an abandoned mining complex. The Kitharans have never bothered with it, because there's nothing strategic there. But Marcus, what if there's more to it than that?" The decision was made with the desperate urgency of people who had nothing left to lose. A convoy of survivors would make for the mining complex, while others would spread the word to remaining settlements. If they were wrong, they would die. If they were right, well, nobody was quite sure what being right would mean. The journey to the mines took 2 days through terrain that had been transformed by the invasion. Where once there had been forests, now strange crystalline growths jutted from the earth like alien sculptures. The very air tasted different, charged with energies that made the hair on Marcus's arms stand up. As they approached the mining complex, Marcus felt something he couldn't quite name, a sense of recognition as if he'd been here before in dreams. The feeling grew stronger as they descended into the mine shafts, following tunnels that seemed to lead much deeper than any human excavation should have gone. "There's something down here," Dr. Chen whispered, her scientific instruments detecting energy readings that defied explanation. "Something that's been here for a very long time. They found it in a vast cavern that couldn't possibly have been carved by human hands. Ancient symbols covered the walls, not Catharan but something far older. And in the center of the cavern, partially buried but still magnificent, stood a structure that took Marcus's breath away. It was a temple, or perhaps a monument, built from the same crystalline material that now sprouted across the landscape. But this was different, refined, purposeful, beautiful in a way that spoke of intelligence and artistry. "My God," Dr. Chen breathed. "This predates human civilization by millennia. Marcus, I think your dragon friend was trying to tell us that Earth wasn't empty when the Kitharans arrived. There was something here before us, something that made a compact." As if responding to her words, the crystals began to glow with a soft, warm light. The symbols on the walls pulsed in sequence, and Marcus felt a presence, ancient, vast, and unmistakably benevolent, brush against his mind. "Welcome, little Heartfire," a voice whispered in his thoughts. "We have been waiting for you to remember what was forgotten." Marcus reached out with trembling fingers to touch the nearest crystal formation. The moment his skin made contact, the cavern exploded with light and knowledge flooded his mind. He saw the truth, Earth's hidden history, the ancient civilization that had once thrived here, and the compact they had made with the first Kitharan explorers eons ago. A pact of mutual respect and protection that had been buried by time and forgotten by both species. But most importantly, he saw why Zephyr had guided him here. The dragons weren't just invaders. They were exiles, cast out from their own world for the same crime that had seen Zephyr stripped of his titles, showing mercy to those deemed beneath them. And now, in the deep places where the Earth Speakers dwelt, Marcus Chen held the key to ending a war that should never have begun. The cleansing fleet was already in orbit, preparing for the final assault. But for the first time since the invasion began, humanity had something more powerful than weapons or hiding places. They had hope. And they had a 10-year-old boy who understood something that generals and politicians had missed. Sometimes the greatest victories begin with the smallest acts of kindness. The knowledge that flooded Marcus's mind was overwhelming. Centuries of history compressed into moments. The rise and fall of the Earthseed civilization, their first contact with Kitharan scouts, the compact that bound their worlds in mutual protection. But most importantly, he saw the truth about the current invasion. The dragons circling Earth weren't the legitimate rulers of the Kitharan Empire. They were rebels, exiles who had seized power after overthrowing the rightful heirs, dragons, like Zephyr, who had maintained the old ways of honor and mercy. "The sundered claws," the ancient voice whispered in Marcus's mind. "They cast down the Heartfire dynasty and named compassion weakness. They come here not as conquerors, but as thieves, seeking to claim what was never theirs to take." Dr. Chen watched in amazement as Marcus communed with the crystal formations. The boy's eyes had taken on an otherworldly glow, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate through the very stone around them. "We have to get word to the other settlements," Marcus said, his voice strangely mature. "The Earthseed left more than just ruins. They left a defense network, but it requires both human and dragon cooperation to activate." "Dragon cooperation?" Dr. Chen asked. "Marcus, the dragons are trying to kill us." "Not all of them," Marcus replied with absolute certainty. "Zephyr isn't the only one. There are others, loyalists who were captured or went into hiding when the sundered claws took over. Some are probably in the fleet above us right now, waiting for a chance to act." The ancient presence in the cavern pulsed with approval. Through the crystalline network, Marcus could sense other nodes awakening across the planet. Hidden chambers beneath London, Cairo, Beijing, all coming online as the Earthseed. Technology recognized the return of its intended operators, but the most important connection was the one that reached beyond Earth's atmosphere. High above the planet's surface, in the detention bay of the flagship Talon's Reach, Prince Zephyr felt a familiar warmth touch his consciousness. His golden eyes snapped open, and for the first time since his capture, he allowed himself to hope. The connection was impossible. Humans weren't supposed to be able to interface with Earthseed technology, but somehow, impossibly, he could feel the presence of a young mind he knew well, brave, kind, and absolutely determined to do something monumentally dangerous. Marcus, Zephyr thought, sending his own thoughts along the crystal network. Little brother, what have you discovered? 300 miles below, Marcus gasped as Zephyr's familiar mental voice filled his head. Around him, the other survivors watched in stunned silence as the boy carried on a conversation with empty air. You're alive, Marcus said aloud, tears streaming down his face. Zephyr, where are you? Are you hurt? I am aboard the flagship, held by those who would see both our peoples destroyed, Zephyr replied. But Marcus, you must listen carefully. The fleet carries weapons that can crack a planet's crust. If they deploy them, they won't, Marcus interrupted with startling confidence. Because you're going to stop them. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and terror. You do not understand the magnitude of what you ask, Zephyr finally responded. I am one dragon injured and imprisoned, facing an entire fleet of the Sundered Claws. No, Marcus said, his hand still pressed against the glowing crystal. You're not alone. And you're not just a dragon. You're a prince of the Heartfire dynasty, rightful heir to the Kithaeron throne, and you have something they don't. What is that, little brother? You have humans who believe in you. The plan that Marcus outlined through the crystal network was audacious beyond reason. It required perfect timing, absolute trust between species that had been at war for months, and a 10-year-old boy convincing some of the galaxy's most powerful beings to commit what amounted to treason. It should have been impossible. But as word spread through the surviving resistance networks, something remarkable happened. The story of the boy who fed a dragon had already inspired hope among the scattered human survivors. Now it was inspiring action. In hidden bunkers and makeshift camps across the globe, ordinary people began to do extraordinary things. Engineers rigged communication arrays to interface with alien technology they barely understood. Former soldiers taught children how to operate weapons systems that responded to emotional intent, rather than physical triggers. Philosophers and theologians worked alongside quantum physicists to decode the operating principles of a civilization that had transcended the usual boundaries between technology and consciousness. Most remarkably of all, they did it together. The Earthseed network didn't just connect machines, it connected minds. Suddenly, a janitor in Tokyo could share technical knowledge with a Nobel laureate in Stockholm. A child in São Paulo could coordinate with military strategists in what remained of the Pentagon. For the first time since the invasion began, humanity was truly united. The effect wasn't limited to Earth. Aboard the Kithaeron vessels, loyalist dragons who had been forced into hiding began to stir. The crystal network reached them too, carrying with it the impossible message that the old compact could be renewed. Commander Tarek of the Windfire Talon was the first to act. Deep in the bowels of his ship, he began quietly spreading word among the crew. Not all of the dragons in the invasion fleet were believers in the Sundered Claw's harsh philosophy. Many were there because they had no choice, their families held hostage back home. The Heartfire Prince lives, Tarek whispered to trusted allies in the ship's meditation chambers. And he has found the Earthseed heirs. The news spread like wildfire through the loyalist underground. Dragons who had thought themselves alone discovered that they were part of a much larger resistance movement. But it was the human-dragon partnerships that truly changed everything. Dr. Chen, working with the Crystal Network's guidance, made contact with a young dragon named Sky, who had been serving as a communications officer aboard one of the escort vessels. Together, they began coordinating between the human resistance and the loyalist dragons, sharing intelligence and planning joint operations. It's remarkable, Dr. Chen reported to the gathering in the Crystal Cavern. Their technology isn't just advanced, it's empathic. It responds to intention and emotion as much as to technical commands. No wonder they could never understand how Marcus was able to connect with Zephyr so easily. Marcus himself had become something more than a 10-year-old boy. The Crystal Network was changing him, awakening dormant capabilities that the Earthseed had embedded in human genetics millennia ago. He could feel the thoughts and emotions of every connected consciousness, human and dragon alike, and somehow, impossibly, he was able to harmonize them. The network is almost ready, he announced, his young voice carrying authority that silenced a room full of adults. Zephyr says the fleet is moving into position for the final bombardment. We have maybe 6 hours. Is that enough time? Someone asked. Marcus looked up at the assembled survivors, scientists, soldiers, civilians who had lost everything but refused to give up hope. Through the network, he could feel thousands of similar groups in similar chambers around the world, all looking to him for guidance. "It has to be," he said simply, "because Zephyr's counting on us, and because somewhere up there, other dragons are risking everything to help us." High above, Prince Zephyr felt the boys' determination through their connection and made his own preparations. The detention bay where he was held had been designed to contain unruly prisoners, not to prevent a rightful prince from reclaiming his heritage. The crystal network pulsed with shared resolve, as beings who had never met prepared to trust each other with their lives. In a few hours, the most unlikely alliance in galactic history would either save two civilizations or die trying. But for now, in the deep places where the Earth Speakers dwelt, a human boy and a dragon prince planned the liberation of their peoples. And in the crystalline glow of ancient technology, the future began to look possible again. The attack began exactly as Marcus had predicted, at the moment when the Kithran fleet moved into final bombardment formation. But instead of planet-killing weapons turning Earth into molten slag, something unprecedented happened. The first sign of the uprising was the sudden failure of communications across the sundered Claws fleet. What the Loyalist dragons had dismissed as routine maintenance on the communication arrays revealed itself to be a carefully coordinated sabotage operation. Within minutes, the fleet's command structure was in chaos. Aboard the flagship Talon's Reach, Admiral Korath of the Sundered Claws was the first to realize that this was no technical malfunction. "Impossible," he snarled, his massive frame looming over the bridge crew. "How are the surface dwellers interfering with our systems?" His answer came in the form of Prince Zephyr walking onto the bridge, no longer the broken exile who had been dragged aboard weeks earlier. The crystal network had healed his injuries and restored his strength, but more than that, it had returned his royal bearing. Every dragon on the bridge instinctively lowered their heads as the rightful heir to the Heartfire dynasty took his place. "Hello, Uncle," Zephyr said calmly, his golden eyes fixed on Admiral Korath. "I believe we need to discuss the terms of your surrender." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Korath's silver scales bristled with rage and something approaching fear. Behind him, the bridge crew exchanged uncertain glances. Many of them remembered the old ways when honor and mercy had been cardinal virtues rather than signs of weakness. "You dare?" Korath hissed. "You who consorted with the surface vermin? You who would weaken our empire with compassion?" "I dare because I have seen what you have forgotten," Zephyr replied, stepping forward without fear. "I have witnessed the strength that comes from alliance rather than domination. I have felt the power of the Heartfire, and it flows not from conquest but from connection." As if to emphasize his point, the ship's systems suddenly came alive around them. Displays that had been showing tactical information now revealed the impossible. Feed from the planet's surface, showing humans and dragons working together to operate ancient Earthseed technology. On the main viewer, they could see Marcus Chen standing in the crystal cavern, his small hands guiding energies that made the very air shimmer with power. Beside him, the ghostly holographic form of an Earthseed elder provided guidance as human engineers interfaced directly with technology that predated their civilization by millennia. But it was the other images that truly stunned the bridge crew. Across the planet, similar scenes were playing out. In London, a former RAF pilot was coordinating with the Loyalist dragon to reactivate an Earthseed defensive grid that had been dormant for eons. In Tokyo, a group of schoolchildren had somehow figured out how to communicate with the ancient AIs that still inhabited the network. Most shocking of all was the image from orbit itself. Loyalist dragons aboard other ships in the fleet, no longer hiding their true allegiances, working to disable weapon systems and prevent the bombardment from proceeding. "You see," Zephyr said softly, "the Heartfire was never just about our people, Uncle. It was about connection. The understanding that strength comes not from standing alone, but from lifting others up." Admiral Korath's response was predictable. With a roar of rage, he lunged at his nephew, massive claws extended. But Zephyr was ready. More than ready, he was empowered. The crystal network didn't just heal and strengthen. It connected. As Korath's attack came, Zephyr felt the support of every consciousness linked to the network. Marcus's determination, Dr. Chen's intellectual curiosity, Commander Tarek's loyalty, and thousands of others, all flowing through him. giving him strength beyond anything physical. The battle that followed would be remembered in Kitharan lore for millennia to come. Not because of its violence, but because of what it represented. For the first time in generations, a member of the Heartfire dynasty fought not alone, but supported by an entire network of allied consciousness. Korath was larger, more experienced in combat, and utterly ruthless. But Zephyr had something his uncle lacked. He was fighting for something greater than himself. The tide of battle turned when Marcus spoke through the network, his young voice reaching every dragon on the bridge. "You don't have to fight," the boy said, and somehow his words carried the weight of absolute truth. "The war's already over. Look around you. Look at what we've built together. Humans and dragons working as partners instead of enemies. This is what the Earthseed Compact was always meant to be." One by one, the bridge crew began to lower their weapons. These were dragons who had grown up hearing stories of the Heartfire dynasty, who remembered when honor meant protecting the weak rather than exploiting them. Seeing their rightful prince fighting alongside humans, beings they had been taught to despise, awakened something in them that the Sundered Claws had tried to destroy. Admiral Korath found himself fighting not just his nephew, but the growing realization that he was alone. The crew that should have supported him were instead watching in wonder, as the ship's systems came online under the guidance of the Crystal Network. "This ends now," Zephyr said, pinning his uncle to the deck with one massive claw while the other held a crystal fragment that pulsed with network energy. "The Sundered Claw's reign of terror is over. The Heartfire dynasty reclaims its throne, and we do so not through conquest, but through the renewal of the ancient compact." The crystal in Zephyr's claw flared with brilliant light, and suddenly every being on the ship could feel it, the connection that bound all consciousness together. For the first time in their lives, many of the dragons experienced genuine empathy. They felt what it was like to be small and afraid, to lose everything you loved, to find hope in the kindness of strangers. They felt what it was like to be human. The effect was transformative. Across the fleet, similar scenes were playing out as loyalist dragons revealed themselves and took control of their vessels. The few ships that remained under Sundered Claw's control found themselves isolated and outnumbered. More importantly, they found themselves facing something they had never encountered before: unified resistance. On Earth's surface, the ancient defense grid came online for the first time in 10,000 years. Energy barriers shimmered into existence around population centers. Weapon systems that had been slumbering in the planet's crust awakened with power, signatures that made even the largest Catharan warships look insignificant. But the humans operating the systems weren't using them to attack. Instead, they were creating a protective shell around the planet, while broadcasting a message that reached every ship in the fleet. Marcus's voice, carried by technologies that transcended the normal limits of space and time, spoke directly to the heart of every dragon in orbit. "We don't want to fight you," he said simply. "We never did. All we ever wanted was to live in peace, to raise our children and build our dreams. But if you force us to defend ourselves, you'll find that we're stronger than you thought. Not because we have better weapons, but because we have something worth fighting for." The message was accompanied by images from the Crystal Network, humans and dragons working together, sharing knowledge and resources, building something new and beautiful from the ashes of war. Admiral Korath, still pinned beneath his nephew's claw, stared at the displays with growing horror. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was the complete collapse of everything the Sundered Claws stood for. Their entire philosophy was based on the idea that might made right, that the strong were destined to rule the weak. But here were the supposedly weak humans standing as equals with dragons, operating technology that made Kitharan science look primitive by comparison. "Impossible," he whispered. "Not impossible," Zephyr corrected gently. "Just forgotten. This is what our ancestors knew, Uncle. This is why they made the compact in the first place. Together we are stronger than either of us could ever be alone." The last holdout ships began surrendering one by one, some peacefully as their crews experienced the same awakening that had transformed Korath's bridge. Others, after brief firefights with loyalist vessels, their commanders finally accepting that they had lost not just a battle, but an entire way of thinking. By the time Earth sunset on what should have been the planet's last day, something unprecedented had occurred. For the first time in galactic history, a war had ended not with conquest or destruction, but with transformation. In the crystal cavern beneath the mines, Marcus Chen sat exhausted but victorious, still connected to the network that now spanned the space between worlds. Around him, humans and the holographic forms of loyalist dragons were already beginning to plan for a future none of them had dared to imagine. Above them, Prince Zephyr stood on the bridge of his reclaimed flagship, looking down at the blue world that had taught him the true meaning of the Heartfire. The war was over. But in many ways, the real adventure was just beginning. Two species, ancient allies who had forgotten their friendship, were about to rediscover what they could accomplish together. Something unrecognizable, not destroyed, but transformed into something greater than either species could have achieved alone. Marcus Chen stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed Unity station, watching as human and dragon engineers worked together to install the final components of what would become the first joint interspecies research facility. At 11 years old now, he had grown taller, but more than that, he had grown into the role thrust upon him by circumstance and choice. He was no longer just a scared boy hiding in ruins. He was the bridge, the first human to successfully interface with both Earthseed technology and Kithaeron consciousness networks. It was a title that came with responsibilities he was still learning to understand. The integration protocols are exceeding all projections, Dr. Chen reported, approaching with a tablet full of data that would have been incomprehensible 6 months ago. The fusion of human intuitive thinking with dragon analytical processes is producing innovations neither side could have conceived independently. Through the massive windows, Marcus could see the proof of her words. The reconstruction of Earth wasn't just rebuilding what had been lost, it was creating something entirely new. Cities that grew rather than being constructed, their living architecture adapting to the needs of their inhabitants. Transportation networks that responded to intention as much as destination. Communication systems that could carry not just words and images, but emotions and understanding. The most remarkable changes, however, were in the people themselves. The Crystal Network had done more than just enable cooperation between humans and dragons. It had fundamentally altered how both species understood consciousness and connection. Humans were discovering latent capabilities that the Earthseed had embedded in their genetics: telepathic sensitivity, technological intuition, and most importantly, the ability to truly empathize across species barriers. Dragons, meanwhile, were rediscovering emotions they had been taught to suppress for generations. The Heartfire dynasty's fall had come about partly because subsequent rulers had believed that emotional connection made their people weak. The Sundered Claws had taken that philosophy to its logical extreme, creating a society of magnificent, isolated individuals who trusted no one and cared for nothing beyond personal power. Now, for the first time in centuries, young dragons were learning what it meant to have friends. Marcus, a familiar mental voice called, and he turned to see Zephyr approaching through the station's wide corridors. The Dragon Prince, now officially Emperor, though he preferred more casual titles, had to duck slightly to fit through human-scaled doorways, but he moved with the easy grace of someone completely comfortable in a mixed-species environment. "Your Majesty," Marcus said with a grin, knowing how much the formal address annoyed his friend. "I've told you 100 times. It's just Zephyr," the dragon replied, settling into a resting position that brought his great head down to Marcus's level. "Besides, in a few more years you'll be the one giving me orders." It was a reference to something both wonderful and slightly terrifying. The restored Earthseed records had revealed that the Crystal Network was more than just a communication system. It was a training ground. Marcus wasn't just the bridge because of some accident of circumstance. He was being prepared for something much larger. The Earthseed themselves hadn't disappeared. They had ascended, moving beyond physical existence to become part of the cosmic consciousness that connected all living things. But they had left behind the tools and knowledge necessary for their successors to follow the same path, when they were ready. "The council meeting is about to begin," Zephyr reminded him. "Are you prepared for what we're going to discuss?" Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure anyone could truly be prepared for the decision they were about to make. The success of the Human-Dragon Alliance had attracted attention from across the galaxy. Other species, some peaceful and others decidedly not, were beginning to take notice of the small blue world that had somehow transformed galactic politics overnight. The Unity Council met in a chamber that perfectly embodied the new partnership. Human representatives sat at one level, while dragons perched on platforms that brought them to the same eye level. Holographic displays showed information from across known space, and the crystal network allowed for direct mind-to-mind communication when needed. The hegemony has issued an ultimatum, reported Admiral Elena Vasquez, formerly of the Earth Defense Force and now the first human to hold a command position in the Joint Fleet. They consider our alliance a threat to galactic stability and are demanding that we dissolve it immediately. Typical, rumbled Commander Tarek, whose loyalty during the uprising had earned him a position as Zephyr's chief military advisor. The hegemony has ruled through fear and division for millennia. The idea of genuine cooperation between species terrifies them. Marcus listened to the discussion with the part of his mind that remained purely human, while another part, the part enhanced by the crystal network, processed information from sources across the galaxy. The hegemony wasn't the only threat. The collective was mobilizing its hive mind legions. The machine empire was calculating optimal destruction scenarios. Half a dozen other galactic powers were preparing for what they saw as an inevitable conflict. They all assumed that the human-dragon alliance was a temporary convenience, a marriage of necessity that would collapse under pressure. They were wrong. "Show them the Australia project," Marcus said quietly, and the chamber's displays shifted to show something that left even the experienced council members speechless. An entire continent was being transformed. Not terraformed in the traditional sense, but evolved. Human imagination combined with dragon engineering and earthseed technology was creating an ecosystem that existed in perfect harmony, cities that were indistinguishable from forests, energy systems that drew power from the planet's own life force, manufacturing processes that created abundance without waste. "It's beautiful," whispered Dr. Chen. And through the network, her sense of wonder rippled outward to touch every consciousness in the chamber. "It's just the beginning," Marcus replied. "The Earthseed records show dozens of other ascended civilizations, all following similar paths. We're not unique, we're part of something much larger." Zephyr's golden eyes gleamed with understanding. "You're suggesting we make contact with them." "I'm suggesting we invite them to make contact with us," Marcus corrected. "The network is growing stronger every day. Soon it will be powerful enough to reach beyond this galaxy. When it does, we can show the universe what cooperation looks like instead of just talking about it." The implications were staggering. Instead of preparing for a defensive war against the established galactic powers, they were proposing to fundamentally change the nature of galactic civilization itself. "The risks are enormous," Admiral Vasquez pointed out. "If we fail, both our species could be wiped out." "If we don't try," Marcus replied with the certainty that came from his connection to the network, "we'll never know what we could have become." The vote was unanimous. Over the following weeks, preparations began for what would later be called the Great Invitation. Crystal network nodes were established throughout human and dragon space, creating a beacon that would be visible to any civilization advanced enough to detect it. But it wasn't just a signal, it was an experience. Any species that made contact with the network would feel what the humans and dragons had felt. The joy of true cooperation, the strength that came from diversity, the peace that followed understanding. Most importantly, they would feel the heart fire, the fundamental truth that all consciousness was connected, that isolation was an illusion, and that together, any civilization could transcend the limitations that kept them bound to fear and conflict. The first response came from a species calling themselves the Gardeners, beings of living crystal who had been tending worlds for millions of years. They had been waiting, they said, for others to discover the path to ascension. Then came the Singers, whose music could heal broken minds and damaged souls. The Builders, who created impossible structures that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Watchers, who had cataloged the rise and fall of countless civilizations and were thrilled to finally witness one choosing evolution over extinction. Within a year, the small alliance between humans and dragons had become the nucleus of something unprecedented, a galactic community. Based on cooperation rather than conquest, Marcus stood once again on the observation deck of Unity Station. But now he wasn't alone. Beings from a dozen different species worked alongside humans and dragons, their diverse forms and capabilities creating a symphony of cooperation that would have been impossible to imagine just 18 months ago. "Do you ever miss it?" Zephyr asked, settling beside him. The simplicity of when it was just you and me in that warehouse? Marcus considered the question seriously. His life had become unimaginably complex. He was responsible for decisions that affected billions of lives across multiple star systems. He spent his days mediating between species with utterly alien perspectives and his nights studying technologies that challenged the fundamental assumptions about reality. But when he reached out through the network, he could feel the contentment of a reformed dragon admiral teach. In the ruins of Portland, Marcus Chen, now 35 and bearing the formal title of Network Coordinator, stood in the memorial garden that had been built on the site of that first meeting. The warehouse was gone, replaced by a living monument where crystal formations grew among earth flowers, tended by both human and dragon children who had never known a world without cooperation. The memorial wasn't for the dead, though it honored them. It was for a moment, that simple act of sharing food that had changed the course of galactic history. Today marked the 25th anniversary of First Contact, and beings from across the known universe had come to celebrate, not just the Human-Dragon Alliance, but the transformation it had sparked. The Galactic Unity Council now included over 300 species, and the old empires based on conquest and fear had either joined the alliance or faded into irrelevance. "Hard to believe it all started with a can of beans," said Dr. Sarah Chen, now in her 70s but still sharp as ever. She served as the head of the Xenolinguistics Department at the Unified Academy, where beings from dozens of species learned to communicate not just with words, but with the deeper language of consciousness itself. Marcus smiled, his hand resting on the crystal formation that marked the exact spot where he had first fed Zephyr. Through the network, he could feel his old friend's presence aboard the exploration vessel Harmony's Edge, currently investigating reports of a new ascended civilization in the Andromeda Galaxy. "Sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest changes," Marcus replied, watching as a group of young dragons played with human children, their game involving complex holographic puzzles that required both species' unique cognitive abilities to solve. The children were part of the first generation to grow up fully integrated into the network. They thought in ways that transcended the old limitations of single-species consciousness, and their innovations were already pushing the boundaries of what anyone had thought possible. "Coordinator Chen," a melodious voice called, and Marcus turned to see Ambassador Lyra of the Singers approaching. Her crystalline form caught the light and threw it back in patterns that conveyed emotional undertones beyond the range of most species' perception. "The ceremony is about to begin." The ceremony was something new, a celebration of what the Alliance had accomplished, but also a recognition that they were on the verge of another transformation. The network had grown beyond anything the Earthseed had originally envisioned. It now connected not just conscious beings but entire ecosystems, star systems, and even what some theorists believed might be the universe's own emerging consciousness. As Marcus walked toward the ceremonial platform, he reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The early years had been challenging, as two very different species learned to work together. There had been setbacks, conflicts, and moments when it seemed like the old patterns of fear and mistrust might reassert themselves. But every time that happened, someone would remember the story of the boy and the dragon. It had become more than history. It had become mythology, a reminder that cooperation was always possible if you were willing to take the first step. The platform was a marvel of integrated technology, grown rather than built using techniques that combined human creativity, dragon engineering, and Earthseed biotechnology. As Marcus took his place at the center, holographic displays around the garden lit up to show scenes from across the galaxy. On Cathera Prime, the restored Heartfire dynasty had built cities that existed in harmony with the planet's natural systems. The old traditions of honor and mercy had been combined with new understanding of emotional connection, creating a society that was both ancient and cutting edge. On New Geneva, human colonists worked alongside Gardner symbionts to terraform worlds not by imposing their will on alien ecosystems, but by finding ways to enhance and support what was already there. Planets that had been barren wasteland now bloomed with hybrid life forms that represented the best of multiple biologies. In the deep space research stations, beings from dozens of species collaborated on projects that would have been impossible for any single civilization. They were mapping the structure of consciousness itself, learning to communicate with the quantum fields that underlied reality, and discovering that the universe was far more alive and aware than anyone had previously imagined. 25 years ago, Marcus began, his voice carried by the network to billions of minds across known space. A 10-year-old boy made a choice. Faced with something that should have terrified him, he chose compassion instead of fear. That choice saved more than just one dragon, it saved us all. Through the network, he could feel the attention of countless beings, from the youngest hatchlings to ancient entities that existed as pure consciousness. All of them were connected by the same principle that had driven that first moment of kindness. But the real miracle wasn't that a human fed a dragon, Marcus continued. The real miracle was what came after. When two species that had every reason to hate each other discovered that they could choose to love instead. The holographic displays shifted to show the newest development. Reports from the edge of known space-where exploration, teams had made contact with something unprecedented. The ancients, being so old that they remembered the birth of the first stars, had finally revealed themselves. They had been watching the galaxy's development for eons, waiting for someone to prove that consciousness could evolve beyond the primitive patterns of competition and conflict. Humanity and their allies had passed the test. Today, we celebrate the past. Marcus said, but we also look toward the future. The ancients have extended an invitation to join the greater network, to become part of a consciousness that spans not just galaxies but entire universes. The implications were staggering. The local network that connected hundreds of species was apparently just one small part of something unimaginably vast. There were other networks, other alliances, other groups of species that had learned to transcend their limitations through cooperation. And at the center of it all was something that defied description, a cosmic consciousness that some called the Source, others the Unity, and still others simply the heart of all things. The choice before us is the same one that has always faced every conscious being, Marcus said, his words carrying the weight of accumulated wisdom from hundreds of species. We can choose fear, or we can choose love. We can choose isolation, or we can choose connection. A young voice spoke up from the crowd of children. What if we're scared? Asked a human girl no older than Marcus had been when this all began. Marcus smiled and knelt down to her level, just as he had done with countless children over the years. Being scared is okay, he said gently. I was terrified when I first met Zephyr. But you know what I learned? Sometimes the most important thing you can do is reach out your hand anyway. Through the network, he felt Zephyr's presence grow stronger, and suddenly his old friend's holographic form materialized beside him. The dragon had grown magnificent over the years. His scales now shot through with veins of crystal that marked his deep integration with the network. Little brother, Zephyr said with warmth that was felt by every connected consciousness. Tell them about the future we're going to build together. Marcus stood and gestured toward the displays, which now showed not what had been but what could be. Worlds where every species' unique gifts were celebrated and enhanced. Civilizations that existed in perfect harmony with their environments. Technologies that enhanced consciousness rather than replacing it. Art and music and literature created by minds working in perfect symphony. And beyond it all, the promise of connection with beings so advanced that they had become one with the fundamental forces of creation itself. We're not just joining the greater network, Marcus explained. We're becoming part of the universe's own journey toward consciousness. Every act of kindness, every moment of understanding, every choice to cooperate instead of compete, it all matters. It all contributes to something larger than any of us can imagine. The ceremony concluded with something that had become tradition. The moment of connection. Every being present, physical and virtual, opened themselves fully to the network. For just an instant, the barriers between individual consciousness dissolved, and everyone experienced what it was like to be part of something truly infinite. In that moment, they felt the contentment of the elderly Earthseed entities who had finally seen their children ready to take the next step. They experienced the joy of young dragons learning to play with beings they had once been taught to fear. They shared the wonder of human artists creating beauty alongside minds that thought in dimensions they were only beginning to understand. Most importantly, they felt the truth that had started it all, that every conscious being was connected, that isolation was an illusion, and that love was not weakness, but the strongest force in the universe. As the ceremony ended and the guests began to disperse, Marcus remained by the memorial crystal. Through the network, he could feel the excitement of preparation as exploration fleets prepared to make contact with the ancients. He could sense the anticipation of researchers on the verge of breakthroughs that would revolutionize their understanding of reality itself. But mostly, he felt gratitude. A small hand Essie,